The opinions on this program are those of the program host and guest and not necessarily those of WPSL. WPSL does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WPSL. Legal questions? Ask a lawyer. Give us a call at 340-1590, 340-1590 here at the studios of WPSL. And Ask a Lawyer with your host, attorney Stuart M. Address.
Good morning. I am Stuart Address for Ask a Lawyer. It is May 6, 2022, and I'll be taking your questions today, if you call with any, and talking about one primary topic. But before I get there, I want to just mention an observation about our continuing COVID situation. Obviously, we're doing better. A lot of us, including myself, are beginning to go out without masks. Indeed, in most public places, I don't see hide nor hair of a mask. Getting to think about traveling. Indeed, trying to actually plan my honeymoon. Willing to go away now and take some more chances.
The only thing you don't do is go to a White House Correspondents' Dinner.
A White House Correspondents' Dinner, that's right. Or, as I found out from a friend last weekend in Orlando, don't go to weddings. Right? There was a wedding in Orlando of about 120 people. And so far, give or take, 25 of them are COVID positive since the wedding. That's a pretty significant number, which tells you that the wedding was a super spreader event. So there is still danger out there, even though we may all want to pretend that this thing is mostly gone. And I mention it only because hearing about some of the people who are now COVID positive, some of whom I know, makes me again think twice, thrice, I don't know what comes after that, but about going out again, doing things like we normally used to do, movies, restaurants, outings, because the reality is it can still hit you no matter who you is. And this includes people who have been vaccinated and boosted. And that's the scary thing. Now, perhaps it hits you mostly with a very lesser form of COVID. But for me, frankly, with my weight and my other health issues, I don't want to take a chance that I'm going to get some mild form. I don't even want the mild form, frankly, from the descriptions I hear of people who have suffered from it. I don't need to feel any more weight on my chest. So just my 2 cents, given something I learned about just this past weekend. So I would still be safe if I were you folks.
Well, and I saw an occasional mask at Publix. I mean, you could still do that if you want.
Well, there is the occasional mask. Obviously, masks are routine if you're at a doctor's office. There I still see them all the time because they're being required. But other places now, there's the occasional mask, but for the most part, it seems that we're all going unmasked. And I include myself, in that criticism. All right, so what are we going to talk about today other than any questions that you all may have at 772-340-1590?
Oh, by the way, happy Mother's Day to you.
Happy Mother's Day to me. Why? Am I a mother?
You said it. Oh.
I've been called that, but I've always thought that those who predominantly have been single parents get to celebrate Mother's Day and Father's Day. But
You bet. No, that's very true.
does Hallmark have a card for that even?
Well, that would be a good phone call away from Harbor.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to talk about the police, but not just any police. We're going to talk about the first of its kind, first in the nation, election police. The election police of Governor DeSantis.
What?
But come on, Greg. You're aware of this from last week when Governor DeSantis signed a law, a sweeping voting overhaul bill that establishes a new election police force, giving his administration another way to probe election crime.
Well, he passes a new law every day. So
He does seem to
I
pass
lost
new
track.
laws every day. Very conservative ones. I wonder why he's doing that. All right, well, it might have something to do with his 2022 gubernatorial election campaign, but more so with his 2024 presidential election campaign. But it is CNN stated that with the GOP governor's signature, Florida became the first state in the country with a unit focused on election fraud, an exceedingly rare problem that has become an animating issue for some Republican voters following former President Donald Trump's 2020 loss. Now, DeSantis, who is up for re-election this year and is weighing a 2024 presidential bid, signed the bill as he works to burnish his credentials with the ultra-conservative wing of his party. And we can see that with picking a fight with Disney, with LGBTQ, with the gun bill that he threatens he will sign soon, where you can carry a gun without a concealed carry permit. You can carry it in the open. Be a lot of fun here in Florida. And let me just say that this is not my opinion. This comes from statistics that I'm going to get to. Election fraud is exceedingly rare. Rare. The Florida Secretary of State's office says it received 262 election fraud complaints about the 2020 election. And it found a basis to refer only 75 to law enforcement or prosecutors. Nearly 11 million Floridians voted in the 2020 election. 11 million. 262 complaints. 75 referrals to law enforcement. 75 out of 11 million. We have a serious problem, don't we, with voter fraud in the state of Florida. We have limited budgetary money, and let's go spend $7 million on the new election police, because we have got to investigate voter fraud. Not that we don't already. Well, the new law creates an Office of Election Crimes and Security within the Florida Department of State. Now, that is an agency under the governor's jurisdiction. It will have a staff of 15 to conduct preliminary investigations of election fraud. In addition, the law calls for DeSantis to appoint up to 10 law enforcement officers to the FDLE to also investigate election crimes, which is where it's investigated now.
So how many homeless could we feed with all those salaries?
Gosh, I guess we could feed a lot of homeless with those salaries and with approximately $7 million annual budget. During the news conference a week or so ago, when he signed the act, DeSantis said that local election supervisors, listen to that, local election supervisors don't necessarily have the expertise and the tools to investigate voting related complaints. Now, okay, let's break that down for a moment. What is the governor really saying? He's saying he wants his handpicked election police to monitor elections in Florida and to investigate claims of voter fraud. Instead of whom? Who are these local election supervisors of whom he's so critical?
They're the ones that have a D behind their name.
Well, D behind their name. I don't think so much. There are two types of people. The very few of them are the elected supervisor of elections, you know, in every county, be a Republican or a Democrat. But who is he really talking about? All the volunteer citizens who sit there and who monitor and administer the voting. He is saying he doesn't trust the people to be fair. The people are Democrats and Republicans. The people, they're volunteers who are dedicated to giving their time to enhancing the ability of people to vote. These are the people who are not trusted. And so we must have a formal election police that is handpicked by the governor, and the governor controls investigations of voter fraud. To me, that smells a recipe for disaster. I mean, the governor is running for re-election in this year. So is his election police supposed to monitor the election and investigate claims of voter fraud? What does that sound like? It sounds like Donald Trump claiming that the election was stolen from him and only he and his people have the knowledge to prove it and to protect against it. That sounds like somebody who would like to take control of whatever office they're in. Now, the new law increases penalties for violating the Florida election laws. It makes it a felony to collect and submit more than 2 vote by mail ballots on behalf of other voters. So now, what is this provision? Remember all those drop boxes in states across the country that are really being limited now by many state measures, but all those drop boxes where you can drop off your vote on election day instead of going into the polling place, or drop off your early ballot. You know, what he is saying is you can't take yours and more than one other person's to drop. Well, why not? I know these ballots very well because I use these ballots because I don't like to wait in line. These ballots require you to sign your name, then close the flap, look it, seal it. You cannot tamper with these ballots without the signature being destroyed. So what is the fear if somebody is carrying 10 or 50 of them? You're dropping them in the ballot box. Election people are going to open that ballot box. Democrats and Republicans always have election observers everywhere. Anybody who thinks any vote is tainted is going to be able to bring it to the attention of the election supervisors. So the limitation and the making of it a felony to drop more than 2 vote ballots into these boxes is an effort to limit voting. because particularly the poor, or those who don't have childcare, or the ill, or the elderly, who may have used a ballot and pre-voted, they now can't just give it to somebody to go drop it in the box. Somehow, they have to find somebody who only has one other, or they have to go themselves. And with that, we have Charlie on line 1 from Palm City. Hello, Charlie.
Hello, Stuart. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Good. Good.
How can I help you?
Well, I have a little issue on the, I think it's common sense that, as far as I use the vote by, we get our ballots, my
Right.
wife and I at our home, we fill them out. Sometimes she'll take my ballot, because I'm 11 years older. But it's common sense to try to cut down on things like I get the Epcot Times, and I'm going to have my eyes sort of lasered in a couple of weeks, so I can read the headline.
Right.
The headline on this paper is Election Watchdog finds 137,500 ballots trafficked in Wisconsin. There is some election fraud. There is.
There is some election fraud. I agree with you completely.
So,
And it is minimal. There will always be some election fraud.
On the possibility of election fraud. Do you remember the Black Panthers hanging out in front of a voting area? This is when Obama was president, and aggressively waving a stick at people coming up to vote, whether they were Democrat or Republican. These people didn't care, and Obama's attorney general refused to even.
And I would agree that was wrong.
Okay.
I don't think any voter should be intimidated. Whoop.
Fine. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there's something wrong with his phone. It just started to feedback there. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, I appreciate your call. And yes, there will always be some voter fraud. I guess the question is, how much is enough to trigger, a $5 to $7 million election police, which has never existed before, when we already have statutory mechanisms to investigate voter fraud. Remember those 275 allegations in 2020 in Florida, of which 75 were referred for further investigation or prosecution.
It's easy. You just have Disney pay for it.
Disney, yeah. So I'm suspicious when you're now limiting how many ballots somebody can drop in for other people that are signed, sealed already. I'm also suspicious when election laws start limiting the number of ballot boxes in counties. For example, and I'm deviating here, in Texas, there are counties that are a couple 100 miles wide. When you start limiting the number of ballot boxes to 1, 2, or 3 in the county, you're making people who want to vote that way drive 100 miles or more. To me, that is an effort to limit votes. And who are you limiting the ability to vote for? It's the same people I just mentioned. It's the older people, the people who are ill, people who don't have childcare, people who have jobs that are mobile. You're not limiting the ability of the wealthy to vote. That's for sure. In addition, our new election law, it also extends a ban on private donations to include, quote, the cost of any litigation related to election expenses, end quote. Now, what does that mean? That sounds very legalese. What that means is that election officials who are sued arising out of alleged election improprieties, and We all know in 2020, oh my gosh, across the country, a lot of people were sued by Mr. Trump and his minions. Well, it means that those people would not have the protection of having their attorney's fees paid by the municipality, the county, what have you. So, who did I say man these voting precincts throughout Florida and throughout the country? For the most part, volunteers, civilians. So now you're going to volunteer your time, and then somebody's going to sue you, alleging you did something wrong. And now the cost of that litigation cannot be paid by the governmental entity. You're on the hook for it. So tell me, how many people want to volunteer now? I don't. That's not a risk I want to take. So that is an anti-democratic reform, couched in the lovely language of banning existing donations or private donations. This is all part of the new election law.
Isn't that the same as pretty much if you're serving on a board that you might be personally liable if they get sued?
You could be personally liable if you serve on a corporate board, if you have breached your fiduciary duty, if you have engaged in malfeasance. Interestingly, in the Florida Corporation Statute, if you serve on a board and you have objected to the action a board has taken, you're off the hook. Your mere objection or vote against it relieves you of liability for what the majority on whatever board has done. And that extends to homeowners associations, everywhere, at least in Florida. If you've advised against it, if you voted against it, you're relieved. I'll tell a funny story before I continue on with the election police in terms of relieving from liability. Back when I was in high school, we had a lot of snow days one year in New Jersey. And so the Board of Education came up with this bright idea that for winter vacation, which was then still called Christmas vacation, if you had prepaid tickets to go away somewhere, you can go on your vacation and make up the work. But if you didn't have prepaid tickets, you had to come to school for one of the 2 weeks of vacation because they were having school. Now, I heard that, Mr. High School speech and debater, and I thought to myself, that's unconstitutional. Now, I was wrong about the constitutional aspect of it. I didn't understand that, the fact that if you were wealthy enough to have prepaid tickets to go away, as opposed to not having that ability, that's not really discrimination. Wealth is not a prohibited characteristic. But all right, I was wrong technically on that, but I thought it was unconstitutional. And I discussed it with the principal, and he told me that there was a board meeting that night, and I decided to go to that board meeting, and I was going to say my piece. And I don't remember what I did, but I did something that led somebody to know that I was going to do that. And I got a call from a local newspaper. Was I really going to go to this board meeting and complain about this policy? And I said, yes. And my father took me, and that was the first time he actually saw me argue in public because he couldn't really go to debates during the weekend. And right before they took a break, I was called on, and I asked, well, about, isn't it true this policy, discriminates against, the poorer or people who are going to go to grandma's house, for vacation and couldn't afford to go to Acapulco, and they get very nervous and they call a recess. So, I'm mingling in the hall during the recess, and a reporter comes up to me and says, let me give you some information. She gives me some information, and we go back in after the recess, and I still have the floor. Very important part of parliamentary procedure. I still have the floor because they call it recess. And I now say, isn't it true that the vote in favor of this policy was 4-3, and that among the three, people were objecting that this policy might not be legal? Oh, now they're caucusing and they're whispering to each other, you know. And I can't recall if there was that discussion about whether it was legal or not, but yes, the vote was 4-3. I say, well, isn't it true that among the three in the minority, it was suggested that you consult with the board's attorney? And it was acknowledged that yes, that was suggested. And I said, well, the board's attorney is sitting right there at the end of the table. Why don't we ask him whether he was consulted with? Turns out nobody did consult with him. So what we learned was there was a very close 4-3 vote for this policy. Among the three, there was 1, 2, or 3 who objected to it on the basis of it not being legal, and who suggested that the board attorney be consulted. And they didn't consult the board attorney, and the policy was enacted. And my appearance and the lovely article that appeared in the next day's paper didn't change anything. I did not win. I made the policy more well known, but I did not win. But if there had been a lawsuit, those three people on the board who had voted against it and had recommended that legal counsel be consulted would not have had any liability. They did not breach their fiduciary duties to basically the school district, which is the board they served upon. Now, as for the 4 who voted for it, they would not necessarily have been liable, but they potentially could have been liable. And here, what we're talking about is stripping even the ability of the entity for which you're volunteering, which here would be the local election office, from covering your legal fees and costs in the event you were sued. So the idea is to make it less desirable to serve and basically have more people appointed by the party in power to monitor the election. All right, now, there had been an earlier challenge to parts of the election law. I'm going to read a paragraph from an article because I want to read it word for word. I don't want to summarize it. DeSantis's action follows a March 31st court ruling that found several aspects of an earlier Florida election law passed in 2021 unconstitutional and improperly targeting Black voters. In that ruling, federal judge Mark Walker also barred the state from making any future election rule changes that are similar to the provisions he struck down, unless the changes are first submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice or the courts for approval or pre-clearance. In a filing this week with the court, Florida officials said they disagreed with Walker's pre-clearance requirement, but would forego enforcing several sections of the law DeSantis signed until they receive further guidance. Those provisions include changes that affect third-party voter registration groups and the use of ballot drop boxes. Florida officials already have filed notice that they intend to appeal Walker's decision to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and election law experts say Walker's ruling is likely to be overturned by either the conservative-leaning 11th Circuit or by the U.S. Supreme Court. So we already have a law that was partially struck down from last year. Yet DeSantis is signing another one and engaging in further restrictions. Now, I was looking at another article from Politico, which again talks about the rarity of voter fraud. And this says voter fraud is rare, typically occurs in isolated instances, and is generally detected. An Associated Press investigation of the 2020 presidential election found fewer than 475 potential cases of voter fraud out of 25.5 million ballots cast in the 6 states where Trump and his allies disputed his loss to President Joe Biden. So, again, do they exist? Sure, they exist. Now, not necessarily voter fraud, but allegations of voter fraud. The instances of real voter fraud are so nominal as to not even, account for a single percentage point. So some have said then that Florida's new law, which critics have deemed as politically motivated and unnecessary, comes after DeSantis first praised the state's 2020 election as smooth, but later said that more rules were needed. So he says in 2020 that Florida's election was among the best and the cleanest and best operated in the country. And now we have the first election police in the country. Now, to me, let's look at this concept of election police. It sounds scary. The intent is for it to be scary. And although we have not previously had quote unquote special police units, called election police or whatever name they're given, we haven't really had election police in this country. We've had, like in Florida, the FDLE, who's always been allowed and able to investigate allegations of voter fraud, but not an agency strictly under, let's say, the governor's control when the governor's going to be running for re-election and when presumably in 2 years he's going to run for president. That just seems like the fox, guarding the hen house. But where else have we seen this in the world? We have seen this in autocratic nations. We have seen this in totalitarian regimes. We have seen this in dictatorships. That's where we've seen this. We've seen this in Nazi Germany. I'm not calling DeSantis a Nazi. I'm just giving it as an illustration of where else election police existed. Anywhere that there are these types of restrictions to scare a voter is undemocratic. There are some countries where you're given the choice to vote between the incumbent dictator, let's say, and his challenger, but the vote isn't private. And when you go to vote, somebody sees how you vote. Well, that's pressure to vote for the incumbent dictator, because goodness knows what's going to happen to you if you vote for the challenger.
So if the FDLE is already doing that, isn't that a duplication of services?
Yes, since the FDLE is authorized to do that by statute, it is a duplication of services. It's unnecessary. It's just an effort by the governor, in my view, to control Who is doing the investigating? His handpicked people. I mean, let's look at the KISS you know what, who he appointed last year or 2 years ago to be head of the State Department of Health, who said all sorts of absurd things that DeSantis said after he fired the former director of health, when we were trying to decide whether or not schools should be open or closed. You know, DeSantis controlled the guy. The guy said the things he wanted to say because he wanted to be, you know, a high politico. And, you know, that's what you get. As contrasted with instances in our history where people have resigned or required the election official in charge to fire them before they would enforce illegal or undemocratic restrictions. Look at Watergate and the attorneys general. Look at the Trump investigations, where he fired one of his attorney generals and threatened to fire another until the one and the next person down the line said, well, if you appoint us, you're gonna have to fire us too. And so he was talked out of it because it was gonna be glaringly embarrassing when the next 3 people had to be fired as well because they wouldn't do what he said. But it's those efforts that ring of an undemocratic tone. And that's exactly what the local Florida police force rings of. Now, let me give you a few more pieces of information and then try to go a little bit to the lighter side of this and still get information in there. We have the Heritage Foundation voter fraud database, which issued a scorecard regarding voter fraud in 2021, mostly stemming from the 2020 election cycle. And that scorecard for Florida, well, first, among 12 states, it found 20 successfully prosecuted cases of voter fraud, 20. 2 in Florida. 2 elections were overturned. 1 in Florida. Now, I will agree, that is a proper use of investigation, presuming, and I do presume, that the one that was overturned in Florida was overturned for non-political reasons. If, let's say, there were 3 instances of provable voter fraud and the person won by 2 votes, well, that overturns the election because his opponent would have won. And I see no problem with that. The Public Interest Legal Foundation found from 2020 156 pending voter fraud cases in Florida, which were officially referred to the state prosecutors, but not deemed worthy to pursue. So that's a further review by the prosecutors as to whether or not they're going to be able to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. And just like in any case, assault, murder, rape, anything, the prosecutors make a decision as to whether or not they believe they have enough evidence to proceed. There have been a number of commentators who have made some other comments about this election police. And then I'm going to get to something I think is more juicy. One of them says, it doesn't just waste taxpayer money. It's one more way partisans are using the myth of widespread voter fraud to cast doubt on free and fair elections. Another says, by continuing to discredit our election system without any evidence, these self-proclaimed protectors of democracy are nothing but arsonists. But look, let's look in reality. What are they doing? They are perpetuating a myth of serious voter fraud in the United States. Look, we are not perfect. And I have no doubt that there has been voter fraud in many elections. But to an extent, to even call most larger elections even potentially into dispute? Not in this country. No, not really. I'm sorry. Not true. And if we are to start believing that, democracy will unwind, which may be the goal of some people. Now, the Cato Institute summarized the problem this way. There are a few things more dangerous than a government agency handed cash and resources with a mandate to solve a problem that does not exist. As a rule, they'll invent it if they have to. Well, we now have this election police with a mandate. Now, there are a number of critics I'm going to summarize here. Critics say the plan is a recipe for disaster. It's all but certain to intimidate voters and suppress the vote. But it's also a curious one for DeSantis, considering his own praise for how the 2020 election was conducted. He said, the way Florida did it, I think inspires confidence. I think that's how elections should be run. I guess he's not of that opinion right now. So now, I have a columnist who writes for the Palm Beach Post that once did a satirical column regarding a sexual harassment lawsuit I had against Publix. This is, gosh, 15 years ago, and I've read them ever since. And he wrote a column on April 30th that gets the point across, which he always does, but with a bit of sarcasm and intentional exaggeration that I thought might be both amusing and elucidating to you folks. His name is Frank Servino, very well known. And he was responding to a reader question about this new election police and a supposed application to join it. And Servino says, "You've come to the right place. I will be vetting candidates for a first in the nation special police unit under the control of Governor Ron DeSantis. As you may have heard, we are rebranding yesterday's voting locations as tomorrow's crime scenes. And we can't do it without people like you. As a member of the elite DeSantis Delta Force, you would be responsible on a moment's notice to throw up obstacles to smooth voting in areas of the state that appear to be voting the wrong way. As a Delta, delivering election logjams to areas, trooper, you will play a key role in deciding the outcome of elections in a state that essentially has an even split between Republicans and Democrats. You correctly note in your application that Florida did have a smooth election in 2020 in a turnout with more than 18 million ballots. There were just 75 incidences of potential fraud that were forwarded to the state Secretary of State's office. And with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement already empowered to investigate election fraud, it might seem, as you suggested, being part of the governor's new election squad would leave you with next to nothing to do. Well, Sarabino continues, but what you're missing here is that DeSantis won the state by just 33,000 votes. And he has currently declared war against Florida's Disney World Resort, a company that employs about 77,000 people in Florida, for refusing to play along with his attempt to normalize bigotry against LGBTQ people. You see the math problem this creates? Now, for those of you who didn't follow, the math problem is he wins by 33,000, he alienates a company that employs 77,000, maybe he has to worry about his reelection. So Sarabino continues. And we can't, as Judeo-Christian adherents to the good parts of the Constitution, allow democracy to turn into mob rule by people who clearly hate Florida and America so much that they might incorrectly not vote to reelect DeSantis. Or to put it another way, our governor's bold leadership style could possibly lead to too much voting in the upcoming November election. And the state's existing election security apparatus just might not be as willing to jump into action to nip this outburst of democracy in the bud before it has a chance to be counted or correctly inspected for bamboo filters from China. As you probably know, Carabino says in his response to this voter who is inquiring about serving on the election police, the state is already taking steps to advise its citizens that voting may just be something that's way too inconvenient to accomplish and might be better off skipped. To that end, Florida has officially ended the use of the words drop boxes to describe places where voters can conveniently deposit their mail-in ballots. These drop boxes are now mostly characterized as potential felony locations that have been formally renamed as secure ballot initiative stations by state lawmakers. This is costing county election officers tens of thousands of dollars to eliminate the words drop boxes from their literature and replace them with the new secure ballot intake station jargon. While it might seem a little Orwellian and a waste of money, it's important to our governor, who needs to go around the state crying, "We ban drop boxes in the state of Florida." It's like slapping a Mercedes emblem on the hood of your Chevrolet and announcing, "I got rid of my Chevy." This tomfoolery over drop boxes probably wouldn't work in the smart states, but it's fine for Florida. Now, Sarabino says, I have some other name change suggestions to make. The name voting booth could be changed to possible tally location in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. Democrats, Democrats, Democrats. And citizens who share water while waiting in long voting lines outside on election day could be called hydration agents. So Sarabino concludes, I think you should plan on DeSantis remaining in election mode until 2024. And there's no telling what new voting restrictions will be in place by then. But I think you can plan on being issued tasers and trained to use high-powered water hoses to disperse heavy turnout election lines in urban areas. Of course, he's being facetious there for, let's just, tase and water hose, all these Democrats in these 3 highly Democratic counties, which also are heavily minority based.
So are these people supposed to work out of the state's attorney's office?
No, there's a special election police office that's been created within the Department of State. In addition to the office in the FDLE. But the one in the Department of State, because of the way the Florida Constitution is organized, is under DeSantis' control, and he gets to pick the people. And there's that good old music. I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson on Florida and elections and how to end a democracy and do your best to avoid it. This is Stuart Address for Ask a Lawyer. I'll be back next week for more discussion on some interesting issue. And have a good weekend, have a good week, and please remain safe because the danger isn't over yet. Thank you.
And remember, elections, ELEXSHUNS. You've been listening to Ask a Lawyer right here on WPSL, Port St. Lucie, Talk of the Treasure Coast, webcaster, and WSDU, Stuart.